Hey family, welcome to New Testament week 17. In this video, we're going to put the woman taken in adultery on trial, and I'm going to show you why I don't think she was actually taken in adultery. So sit back, relax, enjoy my crazy theory, and let's chat. I actually came across this last year in my study of the law of Moses. Numbers chapter 5, verses 11 through 29 describe what's called the law of jealousies. Right now, I want you to take a minute and read through it. In a nutshell, this law is for when a husband believes that his wife has been intimate with another man, but no one's witnessed it or caught them in the act, and he doesn't have any evidence to prove it. He's just suspicious. In that case, the man brings his wife to the priest. The priest sweeps some dirt off the floor of the temple and mixes it into some holy water, or water that's been consecrated for purification. Then, after administering some vows and curses and such to the woman, he makes her drink it. If the dirt water makes her sick, she's guilty of adultery. If it doesn't, she's innocent. My first thought when I read this was how sorry I felt for the wrongfully accused woman who had to drink dirt water for no reason. But I couldn't move on. I kept getting the feeling that there was something else there. It was like a little bubble floating on the surface of the water of the aquarium. And the longer I stared at it, the more I was like, that's a frog egg. I just know it. The dirt on the floor. I read a story about that before. Jesus playing around in the dirt on the floor. And then that frog egg sprouted a tail. The woman taken in adultery. So I find the story in John 8. And as I'm checking it against the law of jealousies, that little tadpole is swimming circles in my head. Jesus riding in the dirt. Check. Did the story involve adultery? Check. Wait, was he in the temple when this happened? Was the dirt actually on the floor in the temple? Check. By all appearances, it looks like he's drawing the crowd's attention to the law of jealousies. But why? Doesn't the crowd say she was caught in the act of adultery? And that's when my spiritual tadpole started to sprout its first little leg. A thought came into my mind. What if she wasn't actually taken in adultery? What if she was innocent? So I'm staring at this little half-legged tadpole in my scriptural tank and I'm asking it, really? Really? I was blown away by the possibility. I had always assumed she was guilty because that's what the scriptures call her, right? So I started at the beginning and went through the story verse by verse to test out this crazy theory. In verses 2 through 5, we see Christ teaching in the temple. The scribes and Pharisees bring in a woman who they claim they caught in adultery. Now John refers to her as the woman taken in adultery, as if it's an established fact. But considering that no one in this situation ever verbally says she might be innocent, it's understandable that a bystander like John would assume it was a fitting title. After clarifying that they caught her in the very act, the group of accusers then say that Moses says they should stone her, and then they ask Jesus, "But what do you say?" Now, it's tempting to stop here, and based on their claims, assume she's guilty. But read a little further. In verse 6, it specifies that they're saying this to tempt him, that they might have to accuse him. In other words, they're setting a trap for him. And if they're willing to do something so deceitful to him, why do we assume that these conniving men are telling the truth about the woman? In the past, I took their word for it, figuring they were the experts on the law. This time, though, I went looking for the law that supposedly gives them the authority to put her to death. I found it in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 22, and Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10. Deuteronomy reads, "If a man be found lying with a woman married to an husband, then they shall both of them die, both the man that lay with the woman and the woman." Leviticus further specifies, "The adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death." Now, neither one says anything about stoning, but there are other sexual sins that are punished by stoning, so I'll let that slide. But think about that. The law states that if the two are caught in the act, then both are to be put to death. And the group made it very clear that they caught the woman in the act, which means that they also caught the man. So where is he? Why didn't they bring the guilty man to be put to death like the law requires? Based on the lack of evidence, I have to assume they didn't actually catch her in the act. And here's where we get into my fish flakes. I think Jesus took one look at the lack of guilty man in the group and knew what they were doing. Honestly, he didn't even have to be able to read their minds and hearts to know she hadn't been taken in anything. So he crouches down and begins doodling in the dirt. Do a Google search and you'll find a lot of theories about why he does this. I'd learned that this was to help diffuse the situation. It's hard to keep yelling at someone who stays calm and doesn't yell back. Some people debate about what he wrote, maybe the commandments or the names of her accusers and a list of their sins. But the fact is, whatever he wrote wasn't important enough to be included in the account. So in my mind, he might as well have been doodling. Why? Why in the middle of a woman being sentenced to death would the Savior squat down and start playing in the dirt? This brings us back to the question at the beginning. Why would he draw attention to the law of jealousies? Because if they don't have the evidence to prove they caught her in the act, i.e. the adulterous man, then the law they're citing doesn't apply. I think the whole point of Jesus writing in the dirt was to remind her accusers that the dirt on the floor had the authority to condemn this woman, not them. Talk about passive-aggressive awesomeness. And now our tadpole's front legs appear. After silently calling their bluff and putting them in their place, he says, "He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her." Now, we're all sinners, so this would put us in our place, right? But I got to thinking, what if this isn't just a general reminder that none of us is perfect? What if he was calling their attention to specific sins they'd committed in this situation? Had they, in fact, sinned? If the woman wasn't caught in the act of committing adultery, then by claiming that they did catch her, they were breaking the 9th commandment, which is, "Thou shalt not bear false witness." We find more information about this law in Exodus chapter 23, verses 1 through 2. Quote, "Thou shalt not raise a false report. Put not thine hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil. Neither shalt thou speak in a cause to decline after many to wrest judgment." The last part sounds a little confusing. An alternate translation says, "Thou shalt not follow the crowd to do evil, neither speak up in a lawsuit, being influenced by the majority, to subvert justice." If we give the crowd the benefit of the doubt, then one of them is guilty of raising a false report and claiming he or she caught the woman in the act, and the rest of the crowd is guilty of the second part. That is, they've been influenced by the one person's false report and are all going along with it. Why does this matter? What's the consequence for raising a false report? Deuteronomy 19:16 through 19 explains that when there's a false witness, the judge makes diligent inquisition between the two men stating opposing testimonies. The one that's discovered to be false then receives the punishment that they were trying to bring down on their brother. In other words, if this group's accusation against the woman is found to be false, then every single one of them will be stoned to death, because that's what they were trying to make happen to her. Jesus, the writer of the Law of Moses, knows this. In doodling on the ground, he was letting them know that he knew the truth and their lives were now in his hands, just as the woman's life was in theirs. Had Jesus verbally called them on their false report, he could have had them all put to death. But he wasn't there to exact Law of Moses-style justice. He was there to fulfill the law, to complete it with the mercy missing from it. In giving them a chance to silently withdraw their false accusation, he's giving them a chance to avoid being put to death if they show that same mercy to the woman. He was teaching them an incredibly powerful lesson on the virtue of mercy. And then, as our tadpole's tail recedes, after all the stones are lowered and the crowd departs, he asks the woman where her accusers are. Note here that he doesn't ask if she did it or require her to confess. We read in Numbers chapter 5 verses 6 through 7 that when a person is guilty of a sin or trespass, they have to confess it and then do recompense or restitution, as we call it in the church. For example, if a person steals from someone else, recompense or restitution means giving back what they stole plus a little extra, according to Numbers. Adultery is a very serious sin. Had she committed adultery, the law would require her to confess to her husband at the very least. What recompense she would have to do for him, I'm not sure. But the fact is, Jesus doesn't ask any of that of her. He doesn't reprimand her for cheating, nor does he take this opportunity to teach her the importance of being faithful to her husband, things you'd think the master teacher would have done if she were guilty. He does nothing to insinuate that she actually cheated on her husband. Instead, he asks if anyone has condemned her. Condemn means sentence someone to a particular punishment. She says no one has condemned her, and he says, neither do I condemn thee. He's not saying she is or isn't at fault for anything. He's simply saying that guilty or not, she's not about to be stoned to death. And then he throws a wrench in the cogs when he says, go and sin no more. And I'm like, wait, what? I thought she was innocent. What happened to the fact that they didn't catch her in the act? And if she's guilty, why didn't Jesus tell her to go confess and make restitution? Clearly, she's guilty of something, but what? Well, if the law of jealousy applies, then that implies her husband did suspect she was cheating, and there are a lot of reasons he might suspect that. Maybe her eyes lingered too long on another guy. Maybe she spent too much time around the other guy, or the husband came home and found the second guy just leaving their house. There are a lot of behaviors, aside from being caught in the act, that would arouse this suspicion. The frog of it is this. I think the woman hadn't actually cheated on her husband yet, but I think she was entertaining the idea, and she had her eyes and possibly her heart set on another man. But is it sin if she hasn't acted on the temptation? Yes. We read in Matthew chapter 5, verse 28, quote, whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. And if a man is guilty for simply looking and lusting, then so is a woman, because God is no respecter of persons. Therefore, the sin which Jesus cites in John 8:11 may be the sin of looking and lusting, and of desiring someone other than her husband, not the sin of physically cheating. So that's my crazy theory. Maybe you agree, maybe you don't. Either way, we can take from this the importance of taking an honest look at situations we're called to judge, getting as many of the facts as we can before we pass judgment, and looking for the ethical, fair, yet merciful way to handle it. How quick are we to go with what everyone else thinks, or to ignore certain details about a situation simply because there's not a quick, easy explanation? This week, let's be merciful and be mindful that there are always two sides to a story when we find ourselves having to pass judgment on someone, be it a child or parent, a student, peer or teacher, or a boss, coworker, or employee. I hope this got you excited about pursuing new ways to look at the scriptures. Next week, we'll work our way through Luke chapters 12 through 17 and John 11. Enjoy your feast on the words of Christ, and remember, we're all brothers and sisters in our Heavenly Father's family. We're in this together.